Hello, and welcome everybody. We are so excited to be here in Austin, Texas for South by Southwest EDU. Hello to everybody who is here in person, as well as to our digital audience who will be tuning in over the days and weeks to come. Today's an experiment. We're going to be bringing what are traditionally private conversations into a very public and exciting forum. And that's only possible because of the distinguished panelists who I am so grateful and humbled to be on stage with. Francis Messano, Richard Barth, and Sharhonda Bossier. Can we get a round of applause for our panelists? It's not easy to stand up here and be honest and vulnerable about what it means to be a leader in philanthropy and how we can think about shifting power and possibility, and I'm grateful to each of you for your time and willingness to do so. So as I was saying, today is going to be a conversation on just that, on philanthropy and leaders who are working on cross-cutting issues. K-12, climate change, environmental justice, and economic mobility. We're going to be talking about narrative, power, and what happens when we center philanthropy on the people that we're trying to impact and ensure that their voices are at the table and are being heard. Now, if there were answers to shifting power and influence in philanthropy, we would not be on this stage. So we are going to be talking about solutions and also some things that we've tried along the way that haven't been as successful. My name is Tony Cohn. I'll be moderating today's panel. I'm Director of Strategy for the Mortgage Family Foundation. And one of the initiatives that I'm most proud to lead on behalf of the Mortgage family is something called the Mortgage Acceleration Program Fellowship, which allows us to go to different nonprofits in our network, match them with emerging capable leaders, and be super reactive to their needs and also invest in their development while collaborating together to solve problems that are facing the world in each of those organizations. So I'd love to begin today's conversation by diving right in and asking each of you a question. Francis, I'm going to start with you. We're here because as you have started your leadership of New School Ventures Fund, you've been having what you've described as private conversations to frame your leadership. And I'm curious, how did we get here on stage, and why was this the moment that you decided we should be having this kind of conversation?
Thanks for the question, Tony. And it's really great to be here at South by Southwest on this stage, bringing this conversation to all of you. And I wanted to thank Richard and Sharhonda, so two people who I was having conversations with, for their candor and their willingness to kind of have the conversation out loud with all of you. So just to start off, because you may not know who New Schools is and what we're about. New Schools is a national venture philanthropy. We're based in Oakland, California, but we have staff members all across the country. And essentially what we do is we raise funds and then make investments in early stage innovators, so people with powerful ideas for change in K-12 education. And just to give you a sense, over the last 7 years, we've invested in close to 600 new school models and organizations, with about 60% of them led by people of color, which we're very proud of. And the reason why we wanted to have this conversation is because, as you know, the headlines right now in education are depressing. We're all talking about the 2 decades decline in academic results. We're talking about the mental health crisis that our young people are experiencing. We're talking about teacher vacancies. We're talking about the fact that we don't actually have a broad coalition for change, and a coalition that we feel like can bring enduring change, new solutions that are actually going to help us get out of the current state. And so I think at New Schools, right, we have this window into all these bright spots across the country. So people are creating new schools, creating new learning solutions, new innovative talent models, and those ideas are giving us hope. Hope for the future and hope for what's possible. But a lot of people don't know about it because we're just focused on this deficit-based frame of what's happening in education. We're really not talking about the possibility. I also think what we need to do is to not just ground in what's happening in education. I think we can often get too insular in this work. And so as I've been having conversations to inform my leadership and what we're doing at New Schools, I had a chance to talk to Richard, to talk to Sharhonda, and Richard started to tell me about what's giving him energy, and it was about new ideas and movement for change in the environmental space, and the idea that there's a rallying cry right now: avoid global temperature warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the fact that that's bringing people together, folks are taking risks to think about how do we avoid that? I've had the privilege of watching Sharhonda and her leadership for years, and as I watched EdLock really expand to think about work and education, but also in economic mobility, and also thinking about broadening who is part of her tent, who's part of her coalition, it led me to kind of say, how do we think about education more expansively? I believe education, if we get education right, we will solve our climate problems. We will solve the current state of democracy. We will get to kind of economic thriving. And so drew inspiration from those conversations as well. And so what that led me to say is like, what might we need to do right now to have a more positive, affirming kind of rallying cry for action? What inspiration can we get from other sectors so that we can think about doing this work differently in new coalitions, while also making bets on innovators with the bold ideas that we need right now. I mean, new schools, we had an opportunity to invest in KIPP in the early days. We had an opportunity to invest in EdLock in the early days. And it's like, how do we get more of that philanthropic capital to support the solutions we need most right now? So I'm really excited to have that conversation with this group. So thank you.
Thank you, Frances, and that was a perfect segue into my question for you, Richard, which as CEO of the Robertson Foundation, you think about all kinds of issues all the time, specifically climate change and economic mobility. You also have an expansive background in education from your time at KIPP, being a founding staff member at TFA, Teacher America. My question for you is, what kind of investments need to be made from the philanthropic sector to build the capacity that Frances was just talking about for that coalition building, and what mindsets need to be shifted along the way as well?
Thanks for the question, and like Frances, I'm so grateful to be here. I am here for one reason, because Frances is so good at what she does. We had a conversation in New York in my office, and then like a day later, she's like, what about like coming to Austin and having the same conversation in front of people? I said, okay, I'll give it a try. So I'm gonna do my best to answer, Tony, your question. I will say I am 7 months into philanthropy after spending over 30 years in K-12 public education efforts. So I approach this with huge humility about like what I need to learn, what I'm trying to understand. But I'm going to speak directly to the conversation Frances and I had, because sometimes when you have fresh eyes, when I used to hire people, they would come in, I would do an onboarding, and I'd say, you have fresh eyes. There is nothing more valuable to our effort than your fresh eyes. You're going to see things, you're like, why do we do this? And the answer is probably because we've done it that way for a long time and we just got used to it. Leverage those fresh eyes, like bring them to work at KIPP. So Frances said, what are you picking up? And I said, well, it's interesting. I was probably at that point 3 months into my work at Robertson, and like Tony said, after a whole career in K-12, I was now working also in environment and medical fields. And I think I'd just been off a road trip, global road trip, which I'd never had a chance to do. And I said to Frances, it's energizing. On climate, what was I picking up? And I want to emphasize, like with huge humility, because I am not a climate expert, just learning about it. But what was clear and palpable on the global stage and the US stage was everyone had sort of aligned around the fact that we really just can't let this thing called Earth get any warmer. And it's just getting warmer and getting warmer. And everyone had aligned on the fact that like 1.5 degrees needed to be this, do or die moment. And we needed to do everything we could to prevent it from being reached. And with that clarity, what you then saw, what I was experiencing, was a huge rallying of people all across all different kinds of sectors and experiences and lived realities saying, what do we need to do to be a part of the solution? And I say this because it felt different. There were people working on how to change the way we raise cows or how much beef we produce. There are people working on how do we figure out to store solar and wind power more effectively. There were people talking about how do we build bipartisan coalitions all across the globe. There were people talking about how do we make sure this transition is a just transition, because we've created this problem predominantly in the developed countries, right? The US being number one. And now we're saying to countries that are following, hey, we can't keep this up anymore and you need to be a part of the solution without the resources we have. Everyone, like, in the sense of collective accountability and collective responsibility was palpable. So that everyone was rallied around this 1.5 degrees. We can't let the earth get warmer. Everyone felt like I have a role to play, whether I'm working on a new kind of cement or a political issue. And then the last thing I'd say that felt really different was no one I spoke to in the environment field, and I will say this about working in the medical field as well, ever says things like, well, we tried that. I mean, they'll say we tried that, but they'll say like, I've never met yet someone who said, yeah, Alzheimer's, we tried. Yeah, this kind of cancer, we tried. Or, yeah, it's getting warm out there, we tried. Like the feeling is you're iterating, you're learning, you're iterating, you're learning. Some things you try work, some things don't, but you're building off of a belief system that we don't have an option but to solve this, and with huge recognition that the people in the field who are close to the action are the ones who understand what it's going to take. So I'll close maybe here just saying with huge caveats that these are new fields to me. Experts in this room might say, oh, you're misinterpreting it, but like this has been my impression, is there's a lot going on out there that we could learn from here. Let me say a couple things for philanthropy implications. One I would say is I've seen more in those fields where people are pretty good at defining the problem that they want to work on and less convinced that they've got the solution. And so for a philanthropist, it raises the question like, defining a really important problem probably is a good thing to do. And then asking really capable people who understand the world better than you, how can we help you be part of solving it? Because we're not going to be the solvers. You can really see that in action. Medical field, preeminent in watching that kind of approach, the humility that people bring to it. The last thing I'll just say is there's a deep embracement of the fact that there isn't a silver bullet, and I continue to think still in philanthropy and in all of us, people feel like they need to present their answer as the answer. And when you're in the climate field, if someone said we got to solve the way we build our buildings and that's the answer, people would say that's part of the answer, really important, but it's not the answer. And I think in education, we still struggle with that kind of thinking.
Thank you, Richard, and you're getting me even more excited for this conversation. I see all of our heads just nodding, and I see it in the audience as well. Sharhonda, as the CEO of EdLoc, Education Leaders of Color, you steward a growing network of education leaders who identify as Black, Latino, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native American. And you unapologetically focus on building power within those coalitions who are traditionally marginalized. You're here at South by Southwest, among other things, speaking about the need for education leaders not to stay in their lane. So my question for you is, one, what does that mean? And two, why is that something that we should be talking about now?
Thank you for the question, and thanks for having me. I think I see the silhouettes of some EdLoc members in the room, so hey, y'all. My name is Sharhonda Bossier, and I lead a membership organization called Education Leaders of Color, but I think it's important before I answer your question to talk a little bit about how EdLoc was founded.
Please.
So in 2014, I got invited to a dinner by Kaya Henderson, who at the time was Chancellor of DC Public Schools. And it was a dinner of folks that I had known mostly from the education conference circuit, right? They were the folks that I'd find in the corners. We would talk about what we weren't hearing come up in main stage conversations. And for most of us, that was that we weren't talking explicitly about poverty. We weren't talking explicitly about the other sort of systemic issues and barriers the young people we were serving in our schools were encountering, that their families were trapped in broken immigration systems, that they were living in substandard housing, that they couldn't access high quality health care, and all of those issues that were happening beyond the four walls of the schools were also manifesting in our children's classroom experiences, impacting their academic achievement, et cetera. And so we set out to figure out if we could be a source of mutual support for each other as we made a decision to start talking more explicitly about how education intersected with those broader racial, social, and economic justice issues. So when we officially launched in 2016, we issued a statement entitled No More Sidelines. And we really issued it as an invitation to K-12 educators to join in on conversations and coalitions and work focused on serving our families and focused on ensuring that young people had the access that they needed to the resources and supports to thrive, capitalize on opportunity, and build wealth. For most of us, we started working in education not just because we cared about young people's academic attainment, but because we understood that providing young people with a world-class education also provided them with access to the shortest and surest pathway out of poverty. And what we were encountering in education was that folks were like, your job is to control only what happens within the four walls of this school. But we thought of schools as anchor institutions in communities and as catalysts for change far beyond their four walls. And so we said, what happens if we invite other folks in other sectors into our education conversations? And what happens if we, as educators, start to lend our voices to other conversations? I'll give you guys a good example of how we think about and why we expanded our membership to include folks who are working on some of those other issues. I don't know how many of you heard the story that NPR did a couple weeks ago about the difference in the way that the U.S. Department of Education and Housing and Urban Development define child homelessness. So the U.S. Department of Education defines child homelessness as if you are lacking adequate and permanent nighttime resources and shelter. But HUD defines it if you are lacking shelter altogether or are fleeing domestic violence. So the US Department of Ed says we have 1 million homeless children in this country, and HUD says we have far fewer. The story profiles a mother who lives in a one-room motel with her 7 children, and they do not meet HUD's definition of homeless because they are not lacking shelter altogether. Now, they get a ton of additional academic supports and interventions, right, because they meet the US Department of Ed's definition of homeless. But it means that what this family really needs is stable, secure, and permanent housing, right, which would actually impact the life and academic outcomes for those children. We know that homeless children graduate at 30% less rates than their sort of peers nationally, right? So for us, when people are like, why are you as a network talking about child homelessness, it isn't mission creep for us, right? We can point directly to the impact that that has on graduation rates, on that child's academic attainment, et cetera. And so we think that while it hasn't been our lane traditionally, it's certainly our business, right? And so our invitation is to folks to step off the sidelines and to lend our voices, our experience, and our relationships to the chorus of folks who are calling for, in this particular instance, right, more supports for families experiencing homelessness. And what's been interesting, right, so grant making is only one part of the work that we do, is as we have tried to make this case to our funders, we have been told this isn't education work. This is economic mobility work. This is anti-poverty work. And it's hard because that's why most of us got into education. And we're bumping up against these silos, not just in our work, but in the foundations and philanthropic organizations that are funding us. And so my hope is that our invitation for people to step off the sidelines is also an invitation to folks who are working in philanthropy to think about how internally they are learning from one another, and they are also breaking down those silos, because we are having a tough time doing the case-making work for why educators should be talking about economic mobility and anti-poverty work. But we think that's the only way that we solve the academic and education crisis in this country.
Thank you for providing that context and also that really tactical example. And for our audience, there is going to be a few minutes at the end of this conversation for Q&A. So please think of questions and get ready for an exciting conversation to continue. Sharhonda, piggybacking off of what I just heard from you, a question for the group. So anyone, please jump in. A single problem has many, many stakeholders, many, many complexities. Sharhonda, you just shared that you have stakeholders who come to you and say, that's not an education problem, right? So my question is, as we think about collaboration, that's actually just going to add more stakeholders, more complexity, and potentially make it even harder to move the needle on these very pressing issues. So why should we do it?
Tony, it's true that doing the hard work of collaboration and of coalition building is hard. It'll make the work take longer. We will go slower, but I believe that's a necessary step for us to be able to move faster and to actually solve the solutions that we seek to solve over time. And so yes, it is harder, but I believe that it is worth it. And you know, as you've been talking, Sharhonda and Richard, I think the ideas that are coming up, it's like, we don't, for example, like New Schools, we're only going to focus on education, but we are seeing a lot more ideas that come to us that are addressing kind of a number of other factors that we know that are meeting young people and their families, and that are preventing them from having educational success. So again, this idea of like, how do we expand the boundaries? We have to be willing and able to follow the lead of the innovators that we're seeking to support, following the lead of parents and students, and in terms of what they're saying they need most in this moment in time. And so what that requires us to do is for adults, for us to kind of get our act together, for philanthropy to get her act together, to break down the barriers and the silos that, that Sharhonda, you were mentioning. And I think about that in a couple different ways. It's about working together across bipartisan lines, working together across racial lines. We need to have a multiracial coalition for change. And it's also about thinking about how we break down the power divide. So those who are seeking capital from those who are grantors of capital, we need to rethink the role that we are playing. And this is something that we're taking very seriously at New School. So the idea that we should follow the lead of those who are most impacted by the solutions that we're trying to bring. And so this idea that we at New School shouldn't decide what solutions get to thrive. Instead, we should be facilitators of the best ideas that are out there from people on the ground who are saying, this is what my community needs most. And so what we've been doing at New Schools is that we are now piloting participatory grant making. We're using different advisory bodies. So what that means is that there's no decision that we're making that's not being informed in some way by students, educators, parents, or researchers. And it's really leading us to think differently about our work and how we're approaching it. So for example, in our racial equity portfolio, the idea is that the council that we're working with are pushing us to fund go beyond the boundaries of our current strategy. They're focused on communities who have been the most overlooked, the most underestimated. It is thinking about these more intersectional ideas. It's also leading us to rethink how we do our funding. Like, what questions are we asking in our applications? How much work are we putting on folks before they even have the promise or the potential of getting any dollars from us? It's leading us to challenge the language we're using. I can go on that, right? But this idea of how we do our work, who we do our work with. We in philanthropy, regardless if we're intermediaries or not, need to ask ourselves these hard questions because we must shift how the work is getting done.
I'll make one just, because I'm so new to this, I want to be so careful. Like, I'm so new to philanthropy. I'll do an observation again, looking at the environment. And what Sharhonda was saying struck me so powerfully. I don't know what the right way to get there is, but I think getting to the next version of what are we working for is essential. And I think it's out there. I think there may be a role for philanthropy, or could be a role for some philanthropists to not take the bait and help people say, the more we fall into this either or, the longer we're going to be out of the game, not making a difference for children. No one I meet is anti, in my experience, literacy. I don't meet a lot of people who are like fervently anti-literacy, and I don't think people are fervently anti-student agency. But you could get in a conversation where you would feel like, I got to go get a drink. I can't be in the middle of this. I don't know how we got into this being a battle. So I think we've got to somehow elevate and ask ourselves, what is it we want for young people in the United States, in the world? What is it we're working towards? And when you do that, what it strikes me, and this goes really to Sharhonda's point, people start working differently. There's now, I think I have them right, 11 billion investment package in Indonesia to support them in a just transition. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in America like, why are we doing this? And are American dollars doing this? But the reality is we can't get to where we need to be in terms of arresting the growing temperatures if we don't do that. The first package we did was in South Africa, not the US, it's a global package. I think theirs was 8 billion. Well, where did that 8 billion or 11 billion come from? It came from a definition of a problem that calls for a collective answer. The people who are doing all the venture investing in this space on new kinds of energy, most of them have now come to the belief that they have to be in the policy world too. They literally set up a policy shop, an advocacy shop, and they've got their business because their ideas won't thrive and flourish if the policy environment is restricting them. So the thought that someone would say, well, why, like, housing doesn't really connect to a human being, a child, it's patently absurd, but we probably have to assume responsibility. Not Sharhonda, okay, not Sharhonda, not Francis, I can assume it, of defining this in such a way that people could answer that and sleep okay at night. But for a different question, they might say, oh, like that is education. So that's like my push here would be, how do we get to a definition of the opportunity? I think it's an exciting one. Not get into either or, but such that people don't respond to Sharhonda's articulation as like, that's not education. It is. It's just some of us have defined it in such a way that now we can't see outside.
I think the only thing I would add is that one of the reasons we see collaboration as inefficient is because we are now retrofitting the organizations and institutions that we've built to allow for it. And I hope that many of us, particularly those of us who are building organizations from the ground up right now, think about including that from the start. Because I think we will have a fundamentally different experience of collaboration if we think about it as core to our work from the very beginning.
Richard, I want to just punctuate something that you said. You are relatively new to heading a foundation. I know Francis, you've also transitioned into the leadership role at New School Ventures Fund. I think it's an opportunity to share, if you're comfortable, when you, and please anybody respond, coming into a leadership role for philanthropy, did you have a moment where you were like, whoa, what was surprising to you about the way that decisions were made or the way that work was done? And this could be for anyone. Richard, you kind of inspired that question, but.
So I want to be clear, like I'm in a slightly different situation. I'm not having to raise money. For 30 years of my life, I've been on the other side of the table. I just want to name it, like I have raised money every day. I've never slept without thinking I need to raise money to make payroll for 30 years. I don't have that anymore. And I'm not an intermediary, so it is a different situation. I mean, all the obvious things are true. It's really, I'm only 6 months in. It is hard to know how people are relating to you, right? Because like you can write checks. I would say the thing that I can speak specifically to where I am in my organization and then how it ties to some experience I've had in my old job. Even in my organization, it's a very small, and I love that, lean organization. I do not. I was ready for a smaller place coming off my old job. But people were very siloed. And the medical people, the environment people, the education people don't really know what each other's doing. And there's probably an orientation in philanthropy towards what you might call like fixed expertise. And I was like, they're really smart people. You all can help each other. We're all gonna have to refresh our strategy. Why doesn't everyone get engaged with each other's stuff? And lo and behold, people love it, and their growth rate, like as people, as leaders, goes through the roof. So I found it like so obvious and natural, but I think it's counter to the way my sense is a lot of philanthropy works. To punctuate that, one of the big players in philanthropy, I remember for a year when I was at KIPP, we were trying to explain to them that we were learning a lot about our graduates, high school graduates, and what their life was like after they left high school, particularly how college was going. This is probably 7-8 years ago. And we spent a year trying to get a meeting with this philanthropy where we'd be in the room with their K-12 people and their post-secondary people. And we kept saying, I think it would be good for us to be all in the same room, because what happens is our kids, they turn 18, they may graduate, but they're still the same human being, and they're just over here. And like, we stay in touch with them, so maybe we could all be in this room. And we spent a year, and we got the meeting, and at the last second they said, we just can't pull it off. And so we spent one day on one floor, another day on another floor. And I sat there, I thought, this is insane. So I bring that spirit to my current job, which is like do not let that happen. And this is, it's what breeds probably in more formal philanthropy, what Sharhonda described. It's like, oh, like that's not education. It's like, oh, that's on the second floor. Humbly and with deep respect, I think we have to be careful of this expertise orientation, and it builds into like, we're not the ones who have all the answers. Let's get into like the problem orientation, what's the challenge, the opportunity to solve, and then we're helping other people who really understand it put forth good ideas.
Yeah, I want to build on that idea. I think that is one of the biggest shifts that I want to see in philanthropy. And we're taking steps in this as well, just shifting our definition of expertise. shifting our view of who is an expert. I was saying this in an earlier panel, like if you were to close your eyes right now and imagine a social entrepreneur, who pops up in your head? We have a view, right? And we have a view of who gets to bring their ideas. Who, you know, in our own processes, you know, we know that only, what is it, about 4% of big bet philanthropy actually goes to Black and Latino-led organizations. And a lot of that is because we have a view of whose ideas kind of fit into our mental models, whose resumes actually jive with how we think about innovation and social entrepreneurship. And a lot of times what you find is from leaders of color, from those who might be, you know, unusual suspects bringing new ideas to bear, it may not fit into both our problem definition and our solutions definition. So I think we're at this place where we have to really broaden how we think about expertise and whose ideas really matter, right? Who should be doing this work? And so we're taking a lot of steps on this, but I can tell you, even in our own organization, I wouldn't say we have it all figured out, because once you're in the seat of being a funder, you automatically feel like you need to know, okay, if I'm in this job and I have like the privilege to be able to allocate money, I need to have a point of view about where's the best place to kind of direct it. And in many ways, like what our job is to study up, to understand the research, to understand what's working, to better connect to community leaders, to understand what the needs are, where this work is happening, and to figure out how we can extend risk capital so that promising ideas, you may not have it all figured out, but so promising ideas have the opportunity to thrive for our kids, right? Because I think the thing that unites us up here is this idea that this is about young people thriving, being able to realize their full potential, not what we're defining as their full potential. And so that's something, those are some of the things that we're thinking a lot about at New Schools about the best way to kind of bring that about.
So I'd love to build off of that. There's a lot going on the stage, right? You are all not just thinking about intersectionality in your work, you're also thinking about shifting that power and influence by making sure the proximate voices, the people who are being impacted by the problem that you're trying to solve, are at the table and embedded in the process, not just the outcomes. So I guess you were just speaking to this, Francis, I'd love to understand for folks in the audience, for myself, for each other, tactically as leaders of organizations who are embedding that ethos into their work, what do you do as CEOs, as presidents, to ensure that shows up authentically?
Our Boulder Fund grant program is sort of our marquee grant program. We provide leaders in our network with $100,000 in general operating support. In addition to that, they get an executive coach and sort of strategic communications support, which often startup organizations don't have the budget or capacity for. And we have ceded the decision making to our members. So moment of vulnerability here. The most consistent piece of feedback I get is that I'm a perfectionist, and don't laugh. And I am working on sharing power, right? And in ways big and small with my team and with our members, because we're a membership organization. But what we have learned through the Boulder Fund process is that sharing the power actually allows for different ideas to emerge. It means that we get to see different leaders make it through each step of that process than would likely make it if only the staff or our board were involved in the decision making. And it means that once we've decided on those grantees, they have a nearly 1,000 person membership network wrapping their arms around them. So sort of in response to this question and to your previous one, what I underestimated was the value of the non-financial supports to early stage leaders, particularly early stage leaders of color. Our investment allows them often to unlock larger and longer term investments from other organizations and foundations. It sort of says like, hey, this person has a good idea because EdLock is standing behind them in the way that Francis inviting me to be a part of this panel does that for me and for my leadership. And it means that we get to test some stuff, right? We get to sort of be a lab for the sector in a way that I think the sector was missing for a while before we sort of launched this program. And so I think in ceding some of that decision-making authority to our members, it has, again, allowed us to just see different kinds of ideas and different kinds of leaders flourish and succeed. And I don't think we could take that back now. And what we have also heard from some of our funding partners is as they are starting to pilot participatory grant-making processes in their own organizations, they've come to us to look to our process as a model and an example.
My instinct went to thinking externally about shifting power and influence, and I just appreciate you discussing the importance of starting from within an organization. Richard or Francis, anything to add?
Just to echo something Francis said, I think there's a 7 months into the field, there's probably a fear of not looking smart, of not looking like you figured this out. One of the advantages of me taking on the role is like I don't even try to pretend to be smart on medical environment, and people would know if I try. So it's an advantage because I'm not, and that opens me up to being like, So on this issue of power and people want to give away power, talk about again I keep coming back to like can people handle it? Everyone loves to say it's risk capital. Philanthropy is very risk averse. I mean, it's very risk averse from what I can tell.
And Richard, why do you think that is?
Because I think people don't want to look silly. It's personal, and people feel like, wow, like what if this doesn't work? What's interesting when you get into, again, I'd say like looking at these other fields, take the medical field. What I've been struck by, I spent time at something called Rockefeller University. It's where I live in New York. We invest in them. I spent time with a guy who's younger than me, but not a kid, probably mid-40s. Immigrant from Iran, went to Harvard Medical School, worked at Brigham, working with people of cancer that's metastasized. For 10 years, almost all his patients died. He's like, I think I want to get into the science side because I don't think I can do this. So I meet him. He's probably 10 years younger than me. He's so energized. And I asked him, like, well, what have you figured out? And he's like, oh, well, I figured out a lot of things that don't work. And this guy's like so friggin' educated and I'm like, I mean, he was honest. He's like, well, this like, but he said, I think we're getting closer. And I think we accept that in some things. Like we accept that in medicine a bit, that you're going to have a lot of trial and error. But I think for a lot of other people, it's hard. It's scary to feel like we just gave this scientist money and nothing might come of it. And that really is the deal with medicine. And I think comfort with that is our biggest challenge.
Yeah, what I appreciate about both of your comments is just the idea that we need to be learning in partnership with each other, learning out loud, sharing what's not working, sharing where we need to go next, and providing the funding to enable those new ideas to come about. And one of the things that you mentioned, Sharhonda, that came up for me is I think a conversation we need to have too. It's like, what are we learning as we're doing participatory grant making? Because that risk aversion is showing up in the participatory grant making as well. And so as we are moving forward at new schools and saying we want to do this work differently with educators, with students, with parents, what we're also finding is that those very folks who we're seeking to engage are afraid to take risks too. One, because it's more personal, it's happening in their local community, so the risk appetite might be lower, but also feeling like if you're asking me to come in and to do this work with you, I want to make sure I'm quote unquote doing it right? And our definition of what right looks like it's destined to succeed, the leaders have this kind of background, et cetera, et cetera. And so this bigger question of like, how do we free ourselves all up to think bigger about the solution set that we need to actually get to the outcomes that we seek? How do we actually have a clear rallying cry that people feel like they can come together as we're doing that work of developing new solutions? And there's work for us to do in philanthropy. I think there's work that we each need to do. I mean, educators in classrooms every single day, like the stakes are high. And so what do we need to do to give ourselves the permission to think bigger, to dream bigger, to kind of bring these new ideas? So that's something I'm thinking a lot about.
So now I'm going to ask all of you to talk about just that, Francis, that you've been thinking about, which is the goal is that we probably wouldn't be on stage right now having this conversation, right? The goal would be that philanthropy is collaborative, that proximate voices are at the table. I've had a few moments in this conversation where I've just wanted to like run down the aisle, burst through those doors, and like go change the world, right? Like I felt really motivated. For folks who are in the audience who are feeling like me, how do we elevate this conversation so that it's not only with distinguished leaders who are being proactive and thinking about it, but that it's a part of the daily systems of philanthropy and funding? And as the panelists give that a think. In a few minutes, we're going to transition to the question and answer portion of this panel. So for those of you with a burning question, get ready.
Well, I'll just put out one thing for everyone in this room, in case people are thinking, oh, maybe I'm not part of this solution, or maybe it's not something I can be a part of. It ain't working. So if you think people in this panel figured it out, or someone else behind the screen got it figured out, like, tell me. But I don't think we do. And until we have, again, something new, Sharhonda, that like brings people, that energizes people to come in, like the current path we're on, families are checking out. Young people don't want to go into our field. Politicians are running away. Elected officials don't want to deal with it. We're not attracting new funders. So if you think that's winning, then great. I think like there's a sense that there's a risk of a stall out. I also believe at the same time we have amazing people in this field, in this room, and on this dais with me, amazing people. And I think we have the potential to do amazing work, and I don't think we have an option to walk away from kids. So if you feel like, I've got some thoughts, I think just accepting the fact that we don't have it figured out as a starting point. And what's interesting in other fields, like that sort of is enough for a lot of people to weigh in and jump into the fields. I think so many people in the environment work, they didn't come into it with an expertise first. They came in with we've got to solve something. How can I be a part of it? And they're helping, to advance the effort.
Anything to add, Francis or Sharhonda? Fantastic. A colleague of mine from South by Southwest is here with a microphone. If there are any folks, yes, please, in the front row. Second row.
Hi, everybody. My name is Corey Ashley. I'm with Indigitize Computer Science, which does work to create more access and opportunities and resources for CS, or in CS for Indigenous students, and I'm from the Navajo Nation. So my question for y'all on stage is, how can we innovate and problem solve outside of colonial paradigms? When addressing colonial legacies in education, how do you reimagine and restructure something inherently colonial that still perpetuates the cycles of colonialism?
I think that is how we think about our grant-making work at EdLoc. When we launched the Boulder Fund, it was a for us, by us fund intentionally, so that we were free from some of the chasing of dollars from some of the other, where someone else had already set the agenda, right? We said, if we are going to do this for us and by us, what does it take to do that? We were actually able to raise the first $3 million towards establishing an endowment for the Boulder Fund so that this work can actually sustain itself and survive, even those of us who are currently leading the organization. It's also one of the reasons that our process includes the voices and perspectives of so many of our members, because we do understand that each of us brings our own sort of biases, right? The fact of the matter is, though, just to be honest with you, right, I gotta raise money too, right, in a system where someone holds power over me. I think that is part of the reason why it's really important that we're having this kind of conversation, is what does it mean to think about not just power, but our resources as shared, right, so that we are thinking about how we deploy those differently. When I stepped into this role 2 years ago, I was really nervous about having to fundraise because I was worried about all of the ways I would have to censor myself in order to be a successful fundraiser. And someone said to me, you have to shift how you were thinking about it. You are not asking those people to invest their money in you. You are going to reclaim what is yours. And so that sort of reframe for me has been really helpful in thinking about how I make an ask, how entitled I feel to make that ask, and how I think about my role in making that ask on behalf of my people and the other leaders we serve. It's not a perfect system, but I do think we're moving in the right direction at EdLoc.
Yeah, and something that I can add is that I'm on my own learning journey in terms of how to best engage, support, and amplify ideas from the Indigenous community. I think for so much of the work that we've been doing, we've been talking about supporting low-income students and we've been talking about supporting primarily Black and Latino students, and we haven't actually talked about the unique needs of Indigenous students and Indigenous leaders. And so what I'm finding is as we're doing this work that we need to go on a learning journey, and we have started this because I've learned how the language I use around racial equity does not resonate. My language around diversity does not resonate. And so how do I need to think about broadening the frame so that Indigenous leaders see themselves represented in the folks that we're seeking to partner with? And we need to understand what are the changes that we need to make in order to make sure that people understand that we need to create new ideas both outside of the education system but also inside of the education to drive change. So I think a lot of what you're talking about is we need to have more organizations, more ideas, more sparks to apply pressure on the current education system so that we have those bright spots that can spread, so we have the learning that we need to do to understand how to better support Indigenous leaders and Indigenous students. And I will say, we haven't had that all figured out. We are doing a lot of work on the power sharing. We are doing a lot of work to interrogate our practices, but this is not something where we're gonna say, we've declared victory, we're done, right? And so we need to continue to do the learning in partnership with folks like you.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes.
Looks like there's some hands in the back too.
Fantastic,
At the
thank you.
standing tables.
Hi, my name is Jamila Best, and I have been in the education system for 13 years. I currently serve now as a senior project manager for Power School, and I have learned a lot during this pandemic. I've also taught in about 8 different states. I have now assisted over 520,000 students get online for education, and I've also taught, my own personal 4,000. And I have stayed at that level of a position. I don't know if it's because I'm a Black woman or what the issues might be, if it's the way that I approach things, but with those innovative ideas, being at this position where I'm not able to grow, where I'm able to make great change for companies and great change for, schools, how can I get to share these ideas that come from such a global perspective and yet do not get any play because I'm still here?
And this goes back to the conversation we were having about whose expertise matter, who we're listening to. Like, you just rattled off just all of the deep experience you have because of the work you're doing every single day, and it matters, right? And so the work that we're trying to do at New Schools is figuring out how do we better connect with folks like you who are on the ground, who are doing the hard work every single day. And if you have an idea, what can we do to, one, understand your idea, provide you with funding, provide you with the support. So we're not looking at a traditional resume to say, okay, you can only share your idea with us if you check off certain boxes. We're actually looking at, like, does this idea have the power to fundamentally change education in the ways that we've all been talking about in this panel? And so my advice to you is don't let your current system hold you back. Don't let your role hold you back, right? If you have a powerful idea for change, I know there's many of us that want to hear from you. We got the EdLock Boulder Fund. There are a number of accelerators that are focused on leaders of color, like a Camelback Ventures as an example, as a 4.0 school as an example, New Schools, as I mentioned, right? And so the question is, how do you get access to those organizations that can help you get in, to help you learn, help you refine your idea, help you pilot it so that you get some early evidence about what is or isn't working so that you can keep going, right? And what you will find is those are supportive environments for people of color to dream big. Because I feel like that's the thing we haven't been allowed to do, is to have a dream and to get the support to bring it to life. And so my hope is, I hope you grab those organizations down. If not, there's some New Schoolers here, we can share them with you. But don't let your position tell you who you are. You are a leader in what you're doing every day.
Thank you for your question. That was beautiful, Francis. I see we have a question in the back.
Hello, hey, Don Wilson here. I'm a product leader for a venture-backed startup. We've raised over $500 million and have grown 13x. But what I'm not seeing, I also mentor for Techstars. What I'm not seeing is the shift from just thinking about growing startups, and in this case, ed tech startups, from just writing a check to doing more, where like at Techstars, we come alongside the companies and help them to figure out how to do this, how to build a enduring company. And I'm curious how you all are thinking about, especially the venture funds up there, how you're thinking about doing more than just check writing. Because right now, the failure rate of minority and immigrant founders is 33% higher than those of their peers. And so, you know, I personally focus in on mentoring those kinds of startup founders, and I'm curious about how that works in edtech space.
Yeah, I can share what we're doing at New Schools since you specifically called us out. And we're different than a venture fund in that we're a nonprofit. We give grants, so we give non-dilutive capital, but we are funding nonprofits, for-profits, and individuals who are creating new organizations. And I'm with you. We need a deep management assistance support, deep capacity building supports to make sure that early ideas are able to grow their impact and to thrive over the long term. I don't know if you all are seeing this in your context, but I'm certainly seeing this right now. There's a ton of consolidation happening in our field. More mergers, more acquisitions, a lot of closures, given the economic environment that's happening right now. A lot of leaders talking about succession planning and not knowing what to do or how to navigate that. And all of that, I think, comes down to what you were talking about, which is like, folks need support in like the basic building of a strong organization, right? And I think a lot of times we get people who are really good program experts, really good product experts, but may not be strong organization builders. And we're asking individuals to be heroic in some ways, to think about how they run all of those different elements of a new organization. And so what we do is, in addition to our funding, and so our average grants are range between $150,000 to $250,000, we give about an additional $40,000 worth of management assistance support per organization. It's coaching, in some cases executive coaching. It's access to consultants to focus on things like strategic planning, access to folks who can help you on fundraising, thinking about an earned revenue business model, impact measurement, right? Because to your point, you need a supportive infrastructure to help ideas get off the ground. You can't just give a check. And so I do think we need to see more of that, or more support to organizations that are doing that kind of work, so we have a strong, vibrant, and healthy field.
We have time for one, maybe two more questions. Sure. In the back at the high top.
Hi, Huette Singor with Black Teacher Collaborative. I think, Francis, building off of what you said, the one thing I would just encourage you all to think about is the infrastructure, because when you're really doing bold and innovative things, most of the people who do strategic planning, evaluation, and all of those things, their frameworks, their ways of working, their ways of talking about our work just don't work for us. And so I think that's really critical, as much as we're talking about bringing more leaders with closer proximity to the problem. I think we also have to build a support infrastructure around them that actually serves their needs, and that looks very different, I think, than the traditional consultants and things like that that have served other organizations.
Thank you for sharing that reflection. Would any panelists like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, we learned this with our Boulder Fund recipients. So part of the application was, tell us one big challenge you want to go deep with a coach on for, you know, the year that you're in our portfolio. And what we learned was that there was a ton of learning that needed to happen across and among our grantees too. We were really reluctant to create additional requirements for our grantees, because what we hear from leaders of color is that we often, in addition to the dollars we get, have so many more requirements around, you gotta participate in this cohort, you gotta come to this thing, you gotta work with this person, right? There are all of these additional sort of asks of us and drains on our capacity, which actually detract us from our ability to be able to focus on the work that we're doing. But what that meant was we've actually now built a bench at EdLock of coaches and advisors who are better positioned to support our members, given not just the kinds of problems they're working on, but given their experiences as leaders of color who sit at multiple margins. Because that was very, very important to our folks, and we realized that a lot of folks, no one had built that. We couldn't just go to someone and say like, hey, who do you know who's a good strategic planner? Hey, who do you know who's good at like coaching somebody on fundraising pitching? Because our folks were like, I can't go up there and do what the white man next to me gets to do because I'm not gonna get the same level of investment. So how do I do this in a way that feels authentic to who I am, honors my leadership experiences, and also acknowledges the additional hurdles that I'm up against? So we learned that lesson in real time with our grantees.
Sharhonda, thank you for sharing that with us. Do we have one more question over here?
Hi, thanks. This is a great conversation. My name is Beth Mejia. I'm with Ed Solutions in the Center for Education Market Dynamics. And one of the partners that I'm really interested in, what I've been watching philanthropy, is the relationship to the market. So what my organization does, and I know we're working with some of you, is about helping organizations to understand how the market can impact or can drive your impact. And what's been interesting, and I'd like for you to comment on, is the recent activity between private and public organizations. Lots of nonprofits and for-profits starting to merge, and organizations that are looking at the education market, which of all the markets, and I love that you're talking about medicine, it's the most messed up, right? It is the most broken market that we have. So helping founders and entrepreneurs to understand those market conditions that can help you drive your impact. What do you think about what's happening in that part of philanthropy?
So I won't pretend to be an expert on what's happening in the market on philanthropy. I would say one observation I have that I think speaks to your question is in these other two fields, the relationships between nonprofits, NGOs, government and businesses is more advanced and just more robust. So I'm not saying they're great or they're perfect, but in medicine, right, like you go to a research institution, scientists who really are just obsessed with solving a big challenge, most of them, they're not entirely commercially oriented, but there is this understanding that like if they get to a certain place, it gets handed off to people who then are the ones who would try to commercialize it. It's very developed and clear. Not saying it's perfect, but that does exist in the market. On the environment, some of the biggest innovations, think about the methane work we're doing, the methane satellites. Those are a handoff between research that was done by independent researchers, university-based people who only motivation is to figure out how to reduce methane. And then there's a commercial opportunity because to scale it, it requires a level of capital to build methane satellites that's far beyond what a nonprofit could raise. I don't know the exact answer for us, but I would say there probably is an opportunity in our field to build relationships where people are more clearly thinking about how could we grow our impact through a partnership? Let me say one last thing on this. I say all that, and then I have one caveat, and I may offend. I don't want to offend, but I think my experience is most of the for-profit entrance or work in our field has been very much oriented towards how do I optimize in the current system, and it makes sense. It doesn't lead, if we're trying to say what's the big problem we're trying to solve, I think it's going to ask us to develop solutions that probably don't assume the current system is, here forever and, what we should be designing for. And I think in some of these other fields, there is more openness to the fact that like the current system may not be the installed system forever. And so I'd love to see maybe philanthropy could help people do some thinking that isn't based on can you get this adopted by the state of Texas? Because when everything just comes down to that, like, I'm sorry, no offense, we're in Texas, but it's easy
Richard,
to say.
I do. Can we have a round of applause for our distinguished panelists, please? Thank you all for bringing. I mean, it's not easy to sit up here and talk about big topics like shifting power and influence in philanthropy and how to actually get that done. And thank you for all sharing your own experiences and context with us. I'd love to give you each 2 sentences to answer the following question. What makes you excited? What possibility are you most excited to go out that door and go chase? 1 or 2 sentences.
I'm really excited to hear people say things like we need a multiracial, multi-sector coalition to confront, yes, the education crisis in this country. I'm very excited about that, excited about the momentum we're building at EdLock, and excited about the work that our members are leading every day on that front.
Thank you.
I'm excited to just listen to what is happening in the field right now, and from that, understand what is now possible that might not have been imaginable a decade ago.
I'm excited about the fact that there's bold leadership in this room and across this conference and outside of this, these doors too, and thinking about the role that new schools can play to help the best ideas get off the ground to thrive. So I will say, go to newschools.org. We have an open funding opportunity right now. Share your idea with us. But really thinking about what can we do in philanthropy to really shift our approaches so that we can enable those best ideas to come about. So thanks for your time.
One more time, thank you all. Thanks to our wonderful, wonderful audience for your questions and for joining us today. I feel very, very inspired to make those possibilities a reality. Thank you.